When I opened my eyes in the burn unit, my left hand was wrapped so thick it looked like it belonged to somebody else, and my husband was asking me to sign with it. A mobile notary stood beside him, with her stamp case open. Behind him stood the woman he had been sleeping with, wearing my company badge on a blue cord around her neck. The packet on my tray gave Calvin our lake house, my truck, our joint savings, and what he called temporary authority over Ironwing Aviation. That temporary authority would let him submit a $42 million Army bid using my name and my status as a service-disabled veteran. 4 days later, while I was still learning how to button a shirt with one hand, Calvin and that woman announced their engagement beneath my company logo. They told a room full of contractors that Ironwing was entering a bold new era. They believed I had signed away the only thing that could stop them. They did not understand something every Army mechanic learns early. When a red line across a fastener is broken, it does not hide the fact that something moved. It proves it. Before I tell you why I put my name on any page in that hospital room, answer one question for me. When a man brings a notary instead of flowers, is that business or is it a confession? Leave your answer where you are listening from, because what happened next depended on one mark Calvin never noticed. My name is Rebecca Lawson. Most people call me Beck. I was 58 years old that spring, and I had spent 30 years in Army aviation before retiring as a Chief Warrant Officer Five. I began as a helicopter repairer with grease under my nails and more confidence than sense. I ended my uniformed career as a maintenance test pilot, the person expected to take an aircraft into the air after major work and determine whether every system told the truth. Machines lie less often than people. They still lie. A gauge can stick. A fitting can look seated when it is not. A logbook can be cleaned because somebody cleaned the story instead of the part. The work teaches you to distrust appearances without becoming afraid of them. You look, you touch, you trace, you verify. I carried that habit into civilian life. When I retired, I started Ironwing Aviation in a rented metal building on the south side of Huntsville, Alabama. We repaired hydraulic control units and ground support equipment for military aviation customers. We were not glamorous. We did not build sleek aircraft for magazine covers. We rebuilt the parts that had to work at 2 a.m. on a wet flight line when somebody needed an aircraft ready before sunrise. I owned the company. I controlled it. My service-connected injuries qualified Ironwing for a federal program that reserved certain contracts for businesses genuinely owned and controlled by disabled veterans. The word genuinely matters. The government does not certify a logo, a wedding ring, or a clever sales pitch. It certifies the veteran who truly owns the company and makes its decisions. Calvin knew enough about that rule to make money from it. He did not understand it well enough to respect it. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I had gone into our test bay to inspect a rebuilt hydraulic unit that had failed pressure twice. A young quality technician named Caleb Reed had placed a red rejection tag on the assembly the night before. By the time I arrived, the tag was gone. The work order said the unit had been cleared for another run. That should have stopped everything. Instead, I saw Calvin through the observation window with Sloane Mercer, the woman wearing my badge in the hospital. Calvin ran business development for Ironwing. Sloane was a vice president at Triarch Aerospace, a much larger contractor that had been pressing us to join a bid. They were standing too close, speaking too sharply, and watching me with the stiff attention people use when they are pretending not to watch. I remember touching the red grease pencil in my shirt pocket. I used one every day. In the Army, I marked verified torque points and logbook corrections in red so nobody could pretend later that a page had been checked when it had not. At Ironwing, I put a short red line in the lower corner of every document I personally reviewed. It was an old habit. Calvin teased me about it for years. He called it my little crayon. I called it memory that could survive an argument. I stepped into the test bay and asked where Caleb's rejection tag had gone. The technician at the console looked toward Calvin. That was my second warning. People who know the answer look at the equipment. People who are afraid of the answer look at the boss. I ordered the test stopped. Calvin opened the door and said we were already behind schedule. Sloane said the Army proposal was due the following week and Triarch needed proof that we could meet the production rate. I told her a proposal deadline did not change the pressure rating of a hydraulic fitting. Then the line ruptured. The sound was not an explosion at first. It was a sharp, metallic crack, followed by a white spray so fine it looked like fog. Pressurized fluid struck the hot surface of the test equipment and flashed. Caleb hit the emergency shutoff. Somebody pulled me backward. I remember orange light, the smell of burned cloth, and the concrete floor rising too fast. Then there was nothing until the hospital. My first clear sensation was the pulse monitor tapping out a rhythm beside my bed. My right shoulder had been repaired. 2 fingers on my left hand were burned badly enough to require grafts. My ribs were bruised, and the doctors were watching my lungs because I had inhaled smoke. I could hear the soft push of air through the oxygen line and the squeak of rubber soles in the hall. I thought Calvin would come through the door looking frightened. He came through carrying a leather portfolio. The notary followed him. Sloane entered last. She was wearing a charcoal suit, low heels, and my temporary visitor badge. My name was printed beneath Ironwing Aviation. Seeing it against her blouse hurt in a way the burns did not. A badge is a small thing. But after 30 years in uniform, I knew what it meant when somebody wore an identity they had not earned. Calvin did not touch my hand. He did not ask what the surgeon had said. He set the portfolio on the tray and moved my cup of ice chips to make room. He said, "We need to handle this while you are awake." I asked why Sloane was there. He looked at her, then back at me. The pause lasted less than a second. It was still long enough. He said our marriage had been over for years. He said Sloane understood the future he was trying to build. He said he had filed for divorce that morning and that the papers were generous, considering the circumstances. Considering the circumstances, I was in a burn unit because a part had failed inside my company, and he spoke as if my injury were an inconvenient clause in a contract. He turned the pages for me. The lake house would go to him. So would the restored pickup I had owned since before retirement, though he described it as marital property. He would take the joint savings account and the debt attached to the house. I would keep my Army retired pay, my medical benefits, and Ironwing Aviation. That last line was designed to make the packet look fair. The pages after it were the trap. They named Calvin interim manager of Ironwing for an indefinite recovery period. They authorized him to sign teaming agreements, submit bids, pledge receivables, and replace officers. Another page said I would not interfere with business decisions while my doctors considered me unable to perform normal duties. The final exhibit gave Sloane authority to act as outside program executive for the Army proposal. I read it twice. The notary asked whether I understood what I was signing. Before I could answer, Calvin said I was perfectly lucid. I looked at him. His shirt was pressed. His hair was combed. There was a faint mark on his neck where a collar had rubbed against skin that smelled of a cologne I had never bought him. He had prepared for this morning more carefully than he had prepared for my surgery. Then he said the sentence that ended our marriage more completely than any judge could. "Your name got the company through the door, Beck. I built everything after that. You are a mechanic with a pension. Let people who understand growth run the business." Sloane lowered her eyes, but she did not look ashamed. She looked impatient. I asked for my red grease pencil. Calvin almost laughed. He found it in the clear hospital bag that held the contents of my work clothes. The paint was blistered on one side from the heat. He placed it between the fingers of my right hand. I told the notary I would mark each page I had read. I drew a short red line in the lower right corner of the property pages. I marked the page giving Calvin the house. I marked the page giving him the truck. I marked the page giving him the joint savings and the debts that went with those things. Then I signed those pages. I did not mark the management authority. I did not mark the bid authorization. I did not sign the exhibit naming Sloane. Calvin kept talking while I worked. He said the company needed continuity. He said payroll depended on speed. He said nobody wanted to burden me with decisions while I was healing. Each sentence sounded reasonable by itself. Put together, they formed a cage. A nurse entered to check my oxygen level. Calvin gathered the packet too quickly. One unsigned exhibit slid under the edge of the portfolio. I saw him press it flat with his palm. I also saw Sloane watch my hand instead of my face. I told Calvin I wanted my attorney to review the rest. His jaw tightened. Then he smiled, the clean, patient smile he used at trade shows. "Of course," he said, "we will take care of you." They left with the portfolio. The notary remained behind for a moment. She closed her stamp case and looked at me carefully. I did not notarize the unsigned pages. she said. "I want you to remember that." Then, she wrote her name and phone number on the back of a meal receipt and placed it beneath my water cup. That was the first person in the room who understood I might need a witness. 4 days later, Caleb helped me walk one slow lap around the rehabilitation floor. My phone began buzzing in the pocket of my robe. A former employee had sent me a video from an industry reception at our own hangar. Calvin stood beneath the Ironwing sign with one hand around Sloane's waist. A banner behind them announced a strategic alliance between Ironwing Aviation and Triarch Aerospace. Calvin raised a glass and told the room they were engaged. Then Sloane announced that their team had submitted a $42 million Army aviation support proposal that morning. The camera panned across the crowd. People applauded. On the screen behind Calvin, my name appeared as president and controlling veteran owner. I was still president on paper because they needed me to be. I had simply been removed from every decision that made the title real. Caleb watched the video over my shoulder. His face went pale. "Ma'am," he said, "you did not approve that bid." "No," I said, "I did not." He swallowed hard. Then he told me something Calvin had not expected him to survive the accident with enough courage to say. The coupling that failed had been rejected 3 days earlier. Caleb had documented the wrong serial number, the wrong heat lot, and a supplier name he had never seen before. Calvin had ordered him to remove the rejection tag. When Caleb refused, someone used his login after midnight and changed the record. I looked again at the video of my husband smiling beneath my name. The divorce was not the reason they had rushed into that hospital room. The bid was, and the accident was not merely the worst possible time for Calvin to betray me. It was the reason he believed he had to move before I could stand up and start tracing the parts. To understand how Calvin reached the point where he could stand beside my hospital bed and call me a name on a form, you have to understand what he had once been to me. I met him at a Memorial Day cookout in 2009. I was still on active duty, stationed near Fort Rucker, and he was a commercial insurance broker who could remember every person's name after hearing it once. He had a warm laugh, a steady handshake, and the rare ability to make a crowded room feel less crowded. I had spent most of my adult life around people who communicated in checklists and radio calls. Calvin spoke in stories. At first, that felt like sunlight. He did not mind that I woke before dawn. He learned not to move my boots from the place I left them. When I deployed, he mailed coffee, socks, and newspaper clippings from home. He once drove through a thunderstorm to meet me at an airfield. After a maintenance recovery mission ran 2 days late, he stood beside a vending machine holding a paper cup of bad cocoa, and I remember thinking I had found a man who understood that showing up mattered more than saying the perfect thing. We married the following year in a small church outside Dothan. I was 43. Calvin was 46. Neither of us needed rescuing, which was one reason I trusted the marriage. We had both lived enough life to know the difference between loneliness and love. At least I thought we had. When I retired 5 years later, I was not ready to stop working. My knees were tired. My right ear had lost more hearing than I admitted. My shoulder reminded me of every hard landing when rain came in. But my mind still wanted a mission. Ironwing began with one workbench, 2 borrowed test gauges, and a lease on a building that leaked along the north wall. I sold a small piece of land my father had left me and used the proceeds as startup money. I owned every share. Calvin did not invest cash. What he invested was time. In the beginning, his help was real. He built our first website. He called local suppliers. He convinced a banker to give us a modest line of credit when our financial statements looked more like hope than history. I handled the technical work, quality system, hiring, and every conversation with a customer who needed to know whether a repaired unit was safe. Calvin handled sales and relationships. We were good together because our strengths did not overlap. That changed when the company began winning federal work. Our first government order was small enough to fit on one page. Calvin printed it and framed it. The second was larger. By the 5th year, we had 32 employees and a second test bay. We were still small by aerospace standards, but we had a record for delivering clean work on time. In our world, that was worth more than a polished lobby. Ironwing also became certified as a service-disabled veteran-owned small business. In plain English, that meant the government recognized that a veteran with a qualifying service-connected disability owned at least half the company and truly controlled it. I was not a ceremonial owner. I signed contracts, I hired officers. I controlled the bank authority. I supervised the work that made the company responsible for what left our doors. Calvin began describing that structure differently. At trade shows, he called me the founder and himself the builder. At dinners, he joked that I kept the aircraft safe while he kept the lights on. The jokes were small enough to ignore. That was their usefulness. A large insult demands an answer. A small one can live in a marriage for years while everybody pretends it is humor. I ignored too many. I told myself Calvin needed recognition. I had retired with rank, a ceremony, and a wall full of plaques I rarely displayed. He had no uniform to explain his contribution. So I let him take the microphone. I let him appear in photographs. I let people assume he held authority he did not legally have because I believed the difference would remain clear inside the company. That was my mistake. Authority that is borrowed long enough begins to feel owned by the borrower. Sloane Mercer entered our business in the fall before the accident. Triarch Aerospace had revenues many times larger than ours, but it did not qualify for the veteran set-aside contract the Army was preparing. Ironwing did. Triarch proposed a teaming arrangement. We would lead the bid. They would provide personnel, warehousing, and nationwide reach. On paper, the idea made sense. Sloane came to our first meeting carrying a silver thumb drive on a short chain. She said she did not trust sensitive drafts to email. She was 49, calm, polished, and very good at making a demand sound like an opportunity. Her first proposal gave Triarch control over staffing, pricing, purchasing, and nearly all customer communication. Ironwing would keep the title of prime contractor and a narrow share of the profit. I read the draft once and pushed it back across the table. I said, "The Army is not reserving this work so a large company can wear us like a borrowed jacket." Sloane smiled. Calvin did not. After the meeting, he followed me into the parking lot and accused me of thinking small. He said the contract could change our lives. I told him a contract obtained by pretending I controlled work that somebody else controlled could end the company instead. He said everyone structured deals that way. I said everyone was not a defense. That argument became the weather inside our house. It was always present, even when we spoke about groceries or whether the porch light needed replacing. Calvin stopped asking whether I had reconsidered. He began speaking as if the decision had already been made. He also started carrying a black leather notebook everywhere. He called it his deal book. He wrote down names, percentages, promised fees, and every person he believed owed him something. If it is not in the deal book, he liked to say, it did not happen. I thought the habit was vanity. Later, it became evidence. The first sign of Sloane outside the office was a restaurant receipt in Calvin's coat pocket from a night he said he had been meeting a banker alone. 2 dinners, 1 bottle of wine, a dessert he would never order for himself. I put the receipt on his desk and waited. He said it was business. The second sign was a message that appeared on the dashboard screen of his truck while we were driving home from church. Sloane had written, "She is the only remaining obstacle." Calvin reached for the screen too late. He told me they were discussing the bid. I asked why. A business discussion sounded like a burglary. He said I was being dramatic. That was how our marriage changed at the end. Not through one discovery, but through a steady campaign against the meaning of what I could see. I did not confront Sloane. I did not search Calvin's phone. I had no interest in becoming a guard posted outside a marriage whose only prisoner was me. Instead, I tightened the controls at Ironwing. I required 2 approvals for changes to inspection records. I removed Calvin's ability to alter supplier qualifications. I instructed our information security manager, Nia Brooks, to preserve access logs for all proposal files. I also asked our outside attorney, Marion Price, to review the Triarch draft. Marion had served as an Army judge advocate before building a civilian practice in government contracts and business disputes. She was 63, wore reading glasses on a chain, and had a voice that could make a crowded room lower itself by half. She read the proposed agreement and tapped 1 paragraph with her finger. "A spouse can argue over property," she said. "A spouse cannot lend your veteran status to another company. If you do not control the work, the certification does not become flexible. It becomes false." I rejected the agreement in writing. Calvin did not forgive me for putting the refusal in writing. People who intend to rewrite history dislike documents made before they are ready. By January, he was working later. Sloane's silver thumb drive appeared in our conference room, even on days she was not scheduled to visit. Nia told me someone had attempted to create a new administrator account in our proposal system. Caleb reported that a supplier Calvin favored had delivered fittings without complete traceability papers. Our quality director, Luis Ortega, placed the shipment in quarantine. Calvin called Luis old-fashioned. Luis had spent 24 years maintaining Army helicopters. He considered old-fashioned a compliment. The next morning, the quarantine tape had been cut. I ordered the shipment locked in a separate cage and changed the keys. Calvin accused me of humiliating him in front of employees. I told him the parts did not care about his dignity. He slept in the guest room that night. A week later, I found a loan officer's card in his deal book. The handwritten note beside it said, "Bridge closes after control letter. 780 due by end of quarter." When I asked Calvin what it meant, he took the notebook from my hand and said it concerned a personal investment. He had put money into a hotel renovation outside Birmingham 2 years earlier. The project stalled. I knew he had lost some money. I did not know he had personally guaranteed $780,000 on a short-term loan. He did not tell me then. He told Sloane. What I learned later was that Sloane had offered him a way out. If Ironwing and Triarch won the Army contract under the control arrangement she designed, Triarch would pay a management fee large enough to clear his guarantee. If Triarch later acquired the operating business, Calvin expected a personal payout of more than $3 million. There was only one problem. I would not approve the structure. Then, a rejected hydraulic coupling found its way into my test bay, and I woke up with my hand wrapped in gauze. From Calvin's point of view, the accident solved two problems at once. It made me physically weak, and it gave him a story for why somebody else needed to control Ironwing. From my point of view, it created a third problem he had not considered. I had nothing to do in that hospital bed except heal, remember, and investigate. Marian arrived the next morning carrying no flowers and no false cheer. She brought a yellow legal pad, a thermos of coffee, and the expression she used when facts had offended her personally. The notary came with her. Her name was Denise Harper. She had notarized real estate closings for Calvin's insurance clients and knew him well enough to recognize when his friendliness was being used as pressure. Denise explained exactly what she had witnessed. I had been awake. I had understood the property pages. I had marked and signed 3 specific documents. I had declined to sign the management packet, and she had not stamped it. Marian asked whether Calvin had taken the entire portfolio. Denise said yes. Marian asked whether any blank signature pages had been inside it. Denise thought for a moment. Then she said there had been one extra copy of the marital settlement signature page beneath the signed original. Calvin had said it was for his attorney's file. Marian removed her glasses. That answer bothered her. It bothered me more. She reviewed the property settlement at the foot of my bed. The lake house looked valuable from the road, but Calvin had borrowed against it twice. After the mortgage, the equity line, and a repair loan for the seawall, there was little clean value left. The restored pickup was worth less than Calvin believed and needed a transmission. The joint savings account held enough to cover only a portion of the debts he agreed to assume. Marian said we could fight every item. I said no. That surprised her. I had spent too many years deciding which damaged component could be repaired and which one had to be removed before it harmed the system around it. The house was not my home anymore. The truck carried memories, but memories did not require a title certificate. The money in the joint account had already become the price of learning who Calvin was. I told Marian I would honor the property pages I had signed after she confirmed the numbers. I would not honor any document giving Calvin control of Ironwing. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "You are not surrendering," she said. "You are choosing the battlefield." That was exactly right. Calvin expected me to fight over visible things. He knew how to argue about square footage, appraisals, and account balances. He did not expect me to let him keep the weight while I protected the structure. Marian sent written notice that afternoon. I had independent counsel. I confirmed the property settlement subject to final review. I denied granting any management, proxy, bid authority, or power to change corporate control. She demanded preservation of every paper and electronic record related to the hospital packet, the Triarch proposal, and the test bay accident. Calvin called within 9 minutes. I let the phone ring. He left a message saying Marian was creating unnecessary hostility. He said the bid had already been submitted and withdrawing it would destroy years of work. He said, "My medical condition was making me fearful." That last sentence was useful. People who intend to challenge a woman's competence often begin by describing her caution as confusion. I saved the message. Then I called Nia Brooks. Nia had managed information security for Ironwing for 4 years. Before that, she had worked on network protection for a hospital system, which meant she understood both technology and the creative damage frightened people can do with passwords. I asked her one question: who submitted the Army proposal? She did not answer immediately. I could hear keyboard taps through the phone. Finally, she said the proposal had been uploaded using a new administrator account created at 2:17 in the morning on the day after my accident. The account used my name. It had been approved from Calvin's executive credentials. The upload came from a computer assigned to the business development conference room. I asked whether the system showed external devices. More tapping. Nia said a removable drive had been connected 11 minutes before the final files were uploaded. The device record included a serial identifier. I asked her to compare it with prior meetings involving Triarch. She went quiet again. Then she said the same drive had been connected during 3 earlier visits by Sloane Mercer. A silver thumb drive on a short chain. Sloane did not trust sensitive drafts to email. She had said so in our first meeting, as if secrecy were proof of professionalism. The machine remembered what she preferred to forget. I told Nia not to confront anyone. I asked her to make protected copies of the access logs, the proposal versions, and every file created or modified after my accident. I also asked her to remove my name from the false administrator account without deleting it. Preservation first, correction second, anger last. That order had kept me alive more than once. Next, I spoke with Caleb. He came to the hospital carrying a paper grocery bag. Inside was the red rejection tag that had disappeared from the hydraulic unit. One edge was blackened. He had found it beneath a tool cabinet after the fire. He also brought a printed copy of the email he had sent in Luis the night before the accident. The email listed 3 problems. The coupling serial number did not match the manufacturer's format. The traceability certificate referred to a heat lot that did not exist in the manufacturer's database. The broker who supplied it had been added to our system after normal business hours without quality approval. Caleb said he had refused to clear the part. Calvin told him they needed 1 successful demonstration before the Army proposal deadline. When Caleb still refused, Calvin ordered him to go home and cool off. Somebody later used Caleb's login to change the status from rejected to conditionally accepted. I asked why he had not told me sooner. He looked down at the grocery bag. Because Mr. Lawson said you knew, he said. He told me you were tired of technicians using paperwork to slow growth. He said if I challenged the decision again, I would never work in aviation contracting in Huntsville. Caleb was 27. He had served 6 years as an Army crew chief before a back injury pushed him out. He had a wife, a 2-year-old son, and a mortgage that did not care about courage. I understood why he had been afraid. I also understood why Calvin had chosen him. Bullies rarely begin with the strongest person in the room. They begin with the person who has the most to lose by speaking. I asked Caleb who pulled me away from the fire. He said he did. I told him he had already answered the only question I had about his character. Then I asked whether he was willing to put the rest in writing. He said yes. By the end of that day, Marion had arranged 4 separate evidence holds. Nia protected the computer records. Luis sealed the failed coupling and every part from the same shipment in our quality cage. Denise signed a statement describing the hospital papers. Caleb signed his account of the rejected part and the altered record. I lay in bed with my shoulder braced and dictated a timeline into my phone. The work was familiar. An accident investigation is not a hunt for the first person you dislike. It is a disciplined refusal to let one explanation become truth before the evidence earns it. I separated what I knew from what I suspected. I knew the part lacked valid traceability. I knew Caleb rejected it. I knew his login changed the record while he was not present. I knew Calvin approved a new supplier. I knew Sloane's drive delivered the proposal files. I suspected Calvin and Sloane had used the accident to seize control. I suspected the property settlement was a distraction. I did not yet know how much money had made them desperate. That answer arrived through the mail. 2 days after the bid announcement, Marion received a copy of a financing notice addressed to Calvin at the lake house. A regional lender had approved a bridge loan tied to expected management fees from the Ironwing and Triarch contract team. Calvin had personally guaranteed $780,000. The loan matured at the end of the quarter. If the Army proposal failed or the teaming arrangement became ineligible, the lender could demand immediate repayment and pursue his pledged assets. The house he had insisted on keeping was one of those assets. The packet also referred to a success payment. If the contract was awarded, Triarch would pay a consulting company controlled by Calvin $3,200,000 over the first 18 months. He was not leaving me because he had fallen in love with Sloane. He had fallen into debt, and Sloane had shown him a door with my name printed on it. Marion traced the consulting company to a postal box and a filing created 6 weeks earlier. Calvin was the sole member. His deal book had not been boasting. It had been a map. I asked Marion what would happen if the Army believed I had approved the bid. She said Ironwing could lose its certification. The proposal could be rejected. The company could face suspension from federal work, and false statements could be referred for civil or criminal investigation. She also said conduct by company officers could be blamed on the company if I appeared to know about it or accepted the benefit. Then she gave me the sentence that decided our next move. Silence can look like consent when your name is on the offer. I did not need revenge badly enough to let 32 employees lose their jobs while I waited for Calvin to expose himself. I needed to protect the company first. That meant telling the government the truth before the government had to drag it out of us. From my hospital bed, I called an emergency meeting of Ironwing's board. There were 3 directors. I held 1 seat. Luis held 1. The third belonged to retired Colonel James Avery, who had advised the company since its first federal order. Calvin was an officer, but he was not a director. He had spent years acting as if those words meant the same thing. They did not. We met by secure video. My hospital gown showed above the blanket. Luis sat in the quality office with the sealed evidence box behind him. Colonel Avery joined from his kitchen wearing a flannel shirt and the expression of a man who had canceled dinner for a necessary fight. Nia presented the access logs. Caleb joined long enough to confirm his statement. Marion explained the risk. The board voted to remove Calvin from every officer position, revoke his credentials, freeze payments to his consulting company, and authorize an independent safety and compliance review. The vote was unanimous. Then we approved the harder decision. Ironwing withdrew the $42 million proposal. We sent a written disclosure to the Army Contracting Officer, the Small Business Administration Certification Office, and the appropriate Defense Oversight Channel. We explained that an unauthorized offer had been submitted in my name, that corporate records might have been altered, and that management had taken immediate corrective action. We included no accusations we could not prove. We attached the access logs, the board resolution, and a commitment to provide the independent findings. My finger hovered over the final approval button. That contract could have doubled our revenue. With 1 click, I was giving it up. Calvin would later tell people I destroyed Ironwing out of spite. The truth was the opposite. I withdrew the bid because a company that repairs military equipment cannot ask soldiers to trust its work while lying about who controls it. I pressed send. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the confirmation appeared. The proposal was withdrawn, the disclosure was received, and the story Calvin had built around my silence began to collapse under the weight of my name finally being used by me. The first call came from Calvin before the confirmation page had finished printing in Marion's office. He did not ask whether I was breathing without oxygen yet. He shouted that I had ruined the largest opportunity Ironwing would ever see. He said Triarch had committed people and money. He said the Army would never trust us again. I listened until he ran out of volume. Then I asked one question. Who authorized you to submit my certification? He said I had. I asked him to identify the page. He said my lawyer would receive it. The call ended. 20 minutes later, Marion received a scanned document from Calvin's divorce attorney. It appeared to be the management authorization I had refused to sign in the hospital. My signature sat above the notary block. Denise's stamp appeared beneath it. For 1 cold second, I wondered whether pain medication had stolen a piece of memory from me. Then I saw the lower right corner. There was no red line. Denise saw something else. The stamp image was identical to the stamp on the property settlement, down to a faint ink gap near the letter H in her last name. A real second impression would not land in the exact same pattern. Somebody had copied the image. Marion sent the file to Nia without changing its name. The document properties showed it had been assembled the evening after my accident. The author field carried Sloane's company username. The signed portion had been lifted from the extra copy of the marital settlement page and placed onto the management exhibit. The file had then been flattened so the layers would not show during ordinary viewing. Ordinary viewing was not what Nia did. She called me from her office and said, "They did not forge your handwriting. They forged the page around it." That distinction mattered. Calvin had counted on a copied signature, looking more believable than a clumsy imitation. He had not counted on my old red mark. He had not counted on Denise remembering the duplicate page. He had not counted on the file recording who built it. Most of all, he had not counted on anybody checking. The Army contracting officer assigned to the proposal was Donna Weller. She called me the following morning. Her voice was direct, neither friendly nor hostile. She asked whether I remained the owner and president of Ironwing. I said yes. She asked whether I had authorized the submitted proposal. I said no. She asked whether I had approved any agreement allowing Triarch or Calvin to control staffing, pricing, purchasing, or performance. I said no again. Donna paused, then said, "The government is not examining who stood at the podium. We are examining who had the power to say no." That was the cleanest explanation of control I had ever heard. She told me the proposal would remain withdrawn. The agency would preserve the submission and related certifications. Ironwing's status would be reviewed, but our prompt disclosure and corrective actions would be part of that review. She could not promise an outcome. I appreciated that. Honest professionals rarely promise outcomes before they examine evidence. Triarch's response was less disciplined. Sloane called our main office and demanded access to proposal files. Nia refused. Triarch's general counsel then sent a letter claiming its company had relied on Calvin's apparent authority. Marion answered with the rejected draft agreement, my written refusal, and the access logs showing Sloane's drive delivered the final proposal. By the end of the day, Triarch announced an internal investigation and placed Sloane on leave. The lender moved even faster. Calvin's bridge loan had depended on expected fees from the contract team. Once the proposal was withdrawn and the authority document was disputed, the bank froze further advances. It ordered updated collateral information and demanded that Calvin explain why his consulting company had listed a federal contract payment stream that did not exist. The lake house became a problem before it ever became fully his. Its mortgage, equity line, and seawall loan were all tied to financial statements Calvin had prepared using expected contract income. The bank did not seize anything overnight. Real life is slower than that. It sent letters. It requested documents. It stopped extending convenience. Convenience had been the foundation under Calvin's confidence. Without it, every promise came due at once. He called me 7 times over the next 2 days. The first messages were angry, the next were strategic. By the last one, his voice had changed. He said we could still fix the bid if I signed a clean authorization. He said Sloane had made mistakes because she was trying to protect the company. He said the lender was overreacting. He said employees would blame me when layoffs came. That was his final weapon. Not love, not apology, responsibility. He knew I cared about the people at Ironwing, so he tried to make his choices feel like my burden. I returned the call with Marion listening. I told him no employee would be laid off to preserve his secret consulting fee. I told him the company would use reserves and reduce expansion spending while the review continued. I told him not to contact staff or access company property. Then I said, "You are no longer an officer of Ironwing." The silence on the line was so complete I could hear traffic through his open window. He said, "You cannot do that to me." I said, "I already did." He hung up. The independent safety review began while I was still in rehabilitation. Luis worked with a metallurgical laboratory and the original component manufacturer. The failed coupling was not merely missing paperwork. It had been machined from the wrong alloy. Its thread profile was close enough to fit and wrong enough to fail under sustained pressure. The serial number had been copied from a legitimate part listed in an old catalog. The broker that sold it had existed for less than a year. Its listed office was a rented mailbox. Payment records showed Calvin approved the purchase after Luis rejected the vendor. A draft email recovered from Calvin's company computer instructed the broker to ship directly to the test bay and described the parts as demonstration stock that did not need to enter normal inventory. They did need to enter normal inventory. Anything installed on a test article did. Calvin was not an engineer. He may not have understood exactly how the coupling could fail. That did not excuse him. He understood that qualified people had rejected it. He bypassed them because the demonstration schedule mattered more to him than the reason for the schedule. Sloane's messages filled in the rest. Nia recovered a proposal chat archive that had synchronized from the conference room computer. Sloane had written that Triarch needed a successful pressure run before its executives would approve the teaming package. Calvin answered that he would handle the quality people. Later, after the accident, Sloane wrote that my recovery window gave them perhaps 30 days to lock control before I returned. Calvin replied, "Get the proxy clean and the bid in. Beck will fight over the house first." He knew me well enough to predict the wrong thing. Louise found the Black Deal book in Calvin's locked office during the inventory conducted with Marion present. It was company property in one sense and personal in another, so Marion had an independent examiner copy only pages related to Ironwing, Triarch, suppliers, and the federal bid. The entries were not confessions. They were worse, in a quieter way. They were calculations. One page listed the bridge debt. Another listed Sloane's proposed fee split. Another said veteran control must remain visible until award. Beneath that, Calvin had written management shifts after medical letter. The final line read exit value after year 1. He had reduced my injury, my company, and my service to steps in a transaction. The silver thumb drive appeared in the notebook twice. One entry called it Sloane Master. Another said hospital packet final on drive. Every Chekhov gun was now loaded, though I did not think of it that way at the time. I thought only that the facts were becoming too consistent to dismiss as misunderstanding. My physical recovery moved at a different speed. There is nothing cinematic about learning to use a burned hand. It begins with movements so small they feel insulting. Bend one finger, hold for 3 seconds, release, try again. My therapist, Hannah Pike, made me pick up wooden blocks, turn keys, and pinch clothespins while my shoulder burned from the effort. One afternoon, I became angry enough to sweep the blocks off the table. Hannah waited for the last one to stop rolling. Then she said, "You spent your career respecting tolerances in metal. Give your own body the same courtesy." I apologized. She made me pick up every block. That was fair. At night, when the ward grew quiet, I allowed myself to feel what the investigation kept at a distance. Calvin had not simply betrayed me with another woman. He had studied the places where I was loyal and used them as entry points. He knew I would protect employees. He knew I disliked public scenes. He knew I would rather lose property than turn a divorce into a spectacle. He interpreted restraint as predictability. There were moments when I wanted to call him and demand an explanation large enough to match the damage. No explanation could do that. Debt explained his panic. Sloane explained his fantasy. Resentment explained why he believed he deserved the company. None of those things explained the choice to put a false part under pressure while people stood nearby. A motive can make conduct understandable without making it forgivable. 6 weeks after the accident, Ironwing received formal notice of a federal status and responsibility review. The notice was not a criminal charge. It was an administrative process to determine who had controlled the company, who authorized the proposal, whether false certifications had been made, and whether Ironwing remained responsible enough to do business with the government. Calvin and Sloane were invited to submit information. Triarch was invited. So were we. Marion warned me not to expect a courtroom. There would be no jury, no dramatic objection, and no judge pounding a wooden block. The session would be a disciplined examination of records and disputed facts. That suited me. I had never needed theater. I needed a table large enough for the truth. By then, I could walk without assistance. My left hand remained bandaged, but I could hold the red grease pencil between my thumb and first finger. I wore my old Army service watch because its face was large enough to read without strain. I put the charred rejection tag in a clear evidence sleeve and carried it in my briefcase. The review took place in a federal office building outside Huntsville. Calvin arrived with 2 attorneys. Sloane came with Triarch's counsel and no engagement ring. She looked at me once, then turned toward the window. Calvin still wore his brass wing-shaped tie clip, the one I had given him after Ironwing won its first contract. He touched it twice while the officials arranged their papers. He always touched that clip when he was about to sell a version of himself. The lead reviewing official explained that each side would have a chance to present documents and answer questions. False statements could carry consequences beyond the session. Everyone confirmed they understood. Marion placed one folder in front of me. On top was the hospital authorization Calvin claimed I had signed. In the lower corner was clean white paper where a red line should have been. Calvin looked at the page. Then he looked at my hand. For the first time since the accident, I saw him understand that my little crayon had survived the fire. Calvin's attorney began with the simplest version of their defense. He said I had signed temporary authority while competent, then regretted the decision after learning about Calvin and Sloane. He described the dispute as a painful divorce that had spilled into business. The reviewing official asked Calvin whether he personally watched me sign the management page. Calvin touched the wing on his tie. Yes, he said. Beck read it and signed it in front of the notary. Denise was called into the room. She did not raise her voice. She identified the 3 pages I had marked and signed. She identified the unsigned management exhibit. She stated that she had never placed her stamp on that exhibit. Then Marion showed the enlarged stamp images side by side, including the identical ink gap. The official asked Calvin whether he still maintained that Denise notarized the page. His attorney answered for him. He said there might have been a clerical assembly error. Marion said, "A clerical error does not copy a signature onto a document created the next evening." That opened the second layer. Nia presented the file history. She explained when the false administrator account was created, which credentials approved it, and how the proposal had been uploaded. She showed the management authorization as a layered document before it was flattened. My signature came from the duplicate property page. Denise's stamp came from the same source. The author field belonged to Sloane's Triarch account. The reviewing official asked Sloane whether she had assembled the document. Sloane said she had prepared drafts at Calvin's direction and believed he had authority. Nia placed the removable drive record on the screen. The serial identifier matched the silver drive Sloane had used during earlier meetings. It also matched the device noted in Calvin's dealbook as Hospital Packet Final. Triarch's attorney requested a short recess. The request was denied until the current questions were answered. Sloane stopped looking toward Calvin. That opened the third layer. Marion presented the teaming agreement I had rejected and the version submitted with the Army proposal. The submitted version still named Ironwing as the lead company, but a separate side letter gave Triarch control over staffing, purchasing, price changes, customer communication, and most of the profit. Calvin's consulting company would receive its success payment from Triarch. My role was reduced to maintaining certification and signing documents when needed. Donna Weller, the contracting officer, spoke for the first time since introductions. She said, "A veteran-owned company is not controlled by the veteran when another business holds the decisions and leaves the veteran the label." Calvin's attorney argued that large partners often provide resources. Donna answered, "Resources are permitted. Hidden control is not." The reviewing official asked Calvin why his dealbook said veteran control must remain visible until award. Calvin said the phrase referred to public communication. I watched his hand return to the tie clip. The official turned the page and read the next line aloud. Management shifts after medical letter. Calvin did not answer. That opened the fourth layer. Luis presented the independent findings from the test bay accident. The coupling carried a copied serial number. Its material did not meet the required specification. Its thread profile failed under pressure. The vendor had not been approved by quality. Calvin authorized the purchase, directed shipment around normal receiving, and pressed for a demonstration before the proposal deadline. Caleb described rejecting the part. He described the threat to his career. He described finding the red tag after pulling me away from the fire. Calvin said he never ordered anyone to install an unsafe component. Marion displayed his recovered draft email. It instructed staff to treat the unapproved parts as demonstration stock and bypass normal inventory. The official asked whether demonstrations at Ironwing were exempt from safety controls. Luis said, "Pressure does not care what accounting calls the part." No one in the room spoke for several seconds. That opened the fifth and final layer. The lender record showed Calvin's $780,000 personal guarantee. The consulting agreement showed the $3,200,000 payment he expected after award. Sloane's messages said my recovery created a window to lock control. Calvin's reply said I would fight over the house first. Marion asked permission for me to make a brief statement. The official allowed it. I looked at Calvin. Up close, he seemed older than he had in the hospital. The confidence was still present, but it no longer reached his eyes. I said, "You did not push me aside because I was too injured to run Ironwing. You pushed me aside because I was the one person who could say no to the deal you needed. You treated my service like a key you could borrow, my company like a room you had furnished, and my silence like permission. The house was never the battlefield. Control was." Calvin opened his mouth. I held up the red grease pencil. I said, "In maintenance, when the line is broken, we stop pretending nothing moved." That was the emotional peak of the story for me. Not because Calvin looked defeated, because I heard my own voice state the truth without anger carrying it for me. If you have ever watched someone mistake your patience for permission, put the word enough in the comments. Not because revenge fixes what happened, but because naming the boundary is often the first moment your life belongs to you again. The reviewing official did not announce criminal guilt. That was not the purpose of the session. She stated that the evidence showed the proposal had not been authorized by Ironwing's controlling veteran owner, that false documents had been used to create the appearance of authority, and that the control arrangement described in the side letter was inconsistent with the certification represented in the bid. The matter involving Calvin, Sloane, and Triarch would be referred for further investigation and possible suspension or debarment action. Ironwing's certification review would remain open until the agency completed its assessment of our corrective measures. Our prompt withdrawal, self-disclosure, removal of the responsible officers, and cooperation would be considered. That was not a victory parade. It was a narrow bridge. 32 jobs still depended on how carefully we crossed it. Outside the building, Calvin followed me toward the elevator. Marion stepped between us, but I told her it was all right. He stopped several feet away. "You planned this," he said. I looked at him. "No, Calvin. You planned it. I documented it." The elevator doors opened. Sloane came into the hallway behind him with Triarch's attorney. She walked past Calvin without touching his arm. The engagement ring was gone. Calvin watched her go, then looked back at me as if I had taken something from him. I had not. I had simply stopped him from taking what had never belonged to him. Consequences did not arrive as one dramatic crash. They came as letters, canceled meetings, locked accounts, and people who stopped returning calls. Triarch terminated Sloane after its internal review concluded that she had concealed the side agreement and used company systems to prepare the false authorization. The company withdrew from the Army opportunity and entered its own negotiations with the government. I never learned every term. I learned enough to know that large companies can survive a scandal more easily than the people they place at the center of it. Sloane called me once. She said Calvin had represented that I was willing to step back. She said she had believed the management document would merely formalize what was already true. She said Triarch's executives had pressured her to deliver a qualified partner. I asked whether any executive had told her to copy my signature. She did not answer. I ended the call. Calvin's bridge lender declared a default after he failed to provide a valid contract payment stream. He tried to refinance the lake house, but the disputed consulting income disappeared from the application. He listed the property for sale. The first offer fell through over the seawall repairs. The second came in well below what he had once called its true value. The pickup needed the transmission work I had warned him about. He sold it to a collector in Tennessee. I felt that loss more than I expected. My father had helped me rebuild that truck when I was a young sergeant. But grief is not proof that a decision was wrong. Sometimes it is simply the receipt. The divorce became final in midsummer. I did not challenge the property settlement. Calvin kept the house until the sale closed, the remaining joint funds, and the debts attached to both. I kept Ironwing, my retirement, and the right to live without explaining why my own decisions required his approval. His attorney withdrew the claim that I had signed the management authorization. The forged document was preserved for the federal investigation. Calvin eventually entered an administrative settlement that excluded him from federal contracting work for a period of years and required repayment connected to the improper consulting arrangement. There was no television crew outside a courthouse. No one marched him past cameras. Real accountability is often quieter than revenge stories make it look. It still changes where a person can work, who will lend to him, and whether his name opens doors or closes them. His relationship with Sloane ended before autumn. Mutual acquaintances told me she moved to Atlanta and took a position outside government contracting. Calvin rented a small apartment near Birmingham after the lake house sold. Friends who had celebrated their engagement became harder to reach once the contract disappeared. I did not celebrate any of that. There had been a time when Calvin sat beside a vending machine waiting for me with bad cocoa. There had been a time when he could make me laugh after a 16-hour maintenance day. Watching the man he became lose the life he tried to manufacture did not erase the man he had once been. It made the grief more complicated. Ironwing's review lasted nearly 5 months. We lost the large Army proposal. We lost 2 smaller opportunities because customers did not want uncertainty. We spent money on lawyers, independent testing, new access controls, and a full supplier audit. I cut my own salary to almost nothing for a quarter. Colonel Avery declined his board fee. Luis delayed a planned equipment purchase. We kept all 32 employees. That mattered more to me than the revenue graph. The government eventually confirmed that I still owned and controlled Ironwing. Our certification remained in place under enhanced reporting and an outside compliance monitor. The written decision noted our immediate withdrawal, disclosure, removal of responsible personnel, preservation of evidence, and corrective action. Marion read the letter aloud in our conference room. When she finished, nobody cheered at first. We had been holding our breath too long. Then Caleb started clapping. Luis joined him. Nia covered her face with both hands and laughed. The sound moved through the building until people from the machine shop and shipping area crowded into the hall. I stood at the end of the table with my left hand still stiff and understood that survival rarely feels like winning while you are doing it. It feels like choosing the next correct action before fear chooses for you. I returned to work gradually. For the first month, Hannah allowed me 4 hours a day. I reviewed supplier records, sat in safety meetings, and walked the floor without touching anything heavier than a clipboard. The rebuilt test bay remained closed until every new safeguard had been verified. Caleb helped lead that work. He had blamed himself for the accident because he had not physically removed the rejected coupling from the building. I told him the failure belonged to the people who overrode his documented decision, not to the young technician who made it. Then I promoted him to deputy quality manager and paid for additional certification training. Luis approved the promotion with one condition. He said Caleb still had to sweep the bay when everyone else did. Caleb said that sounded like Luis. It did. By late fall, I could close my left hand around a coffee mug. I could fasten my own buttons. The scars across 2 fingers remained shiny and tight, but they no longer decided what I attempted. Hannah discharged me from regular therapy after I picked up every wooden block, turned every key, and pinched every clothespin without dropping one. She placed the old red grease pencil on the table as my final test. I drew a line across a scrap of paper. It was crooked. Hannah said, "Good enough to tell if something moves." 7 months after the accident, Calvin left me a voicemail. It lasted long enough that I almost deleted it without listening. I waited until evening, sat on my back porch with a blanket over my knees, and pressed play. His voice was lower than I remembered. He said he had begun seeing a therapist. He said the federal settlement had forced him to describe his actions without the words growth, pressure, or misunderstanding. He said his father had refused to lend him money and had asked why he thought being married to me meant he owned what I had earned. Then Calvin said the one thing that made me listen to the end. He said, "I kept telling myself your name was an asset. I never stopped to hear how ugly that was." He did not ask me to fix his finances. He did not ask me to change the settlement. He asked whether I would meet him once. I spoke with Marion, though there was no legal reason to. She had watched me make too many decisions alone and knew the difference between advice and permission. She asked what I wanted from the meeting. I said I wanted to know whether I could sit across from him without becoming the woman in the hospital bed again. We met at a diner near the Tennessee River on a cold Saturday morning. The place served eggs, biscuits, and coffee strong enough to clean tools. We chose a booth with no history in it. Calvin arrived early. He had lost weight. His expensive watch was gone. He wore a plain blue shirt and no tie clip. He stood when I approached. "Thank you for coming," he said. I sat down. The waitress poured coffee for both of us and called us honey without asking whether we deserved it. Calvin apologized in pieces. He apologized for the affair. He apologized for the hospital papers. He apologized for the part, though he still struggled to say that his decision had placed people in danger. He admitted that debt had made him afraid and Sloane had made him feel chosen. He admitted that my refusal to approve the deal felt like humiliation because he had spent years telling people he ran Ironwing. I listened. At one point, he began explaining that he never expected the coupling to fail. I stopped him. I said, "Safety rules exist for what you do not expect." He nodded and did not try again. When he finished, I placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was the brass wing-shaped tie clip recovered from his office after the investigation released it. I had given it to him when Ironwing won its first federal order. At the time, I believed it represented what we had built together. I told him I did not want it. He held the envelope but did not open it. Then he asked whether I could ever forgive him. I took my time. I said, "Forgiveness is not reinstatement. It does not return your access. It does not make your choices smaller. It means I am no longer organizing my life around the hope that you will understand what you did." He looked down at the table. I continued, "You did not need me to be worthless, Calvin. You needed me to seem small enough that taking my name felt reasonable. That is what ended us. Not Sloane, not the debt. You decided my authority was a technicality, and yours was the real thing." His eyes filled, but I did not reach across the table. Comfort can be kind. It can also interrupt a consequence before it finishes teaching. He said he understood. I believed he understood more than he had before. I did not pretend that was the same as repair. We left separately. At the door, he said he hoped Ironwing did well. I said, "I hope you learn to do well without standing on somebody else's name." Outside, the river wind was sharp enough to make my eyes water. I walked to my car, flexed my stiff hand around the keys, and drove home without checking the mirror for him. The following spring, almost 1 year after the fire, I crossed paths with Calvin one last time. Ironwing was hosting a veterans employment workshop with several local manufacturers. I was standing near the registration table when I saw him in the lobby. He had come with a small commercial roofing company that hired him to train sales staff. The work had nothing to do with federal contracts. For a moment, both of us stopped. He looked toward the open hangar behind me, where veterans in work boots were speaking with employers beneath the Ironwing sign. Then he looked at my hand. The scars were visible. I no longer hid them. "You look steady," he said. "I am," I answered. He nodded. There was no request in his face, no performance, just the quiet recognition that the life he once treated as a platform had continued without him. "Take care, Beck," he said. "You too, Calvin." He walked toward his company's table. I walked back into the hangar. That afternoon, we reopened the test bay. The first image I remember is Caleb standing at the control console with the charred rejection tag framed on the wall behind him. Beneath it was a simple sentence: "A stopped job can be restarted. A lost life cannot." The second image is Luis checking the new pressure shield, then handing me the inspection sheet. I drew my red line in the lower corner. It was straighter than the one in Hannah's therapy room. The third image is the hangar door lifting as the test completed successfully. Morning light moved across the concrete. 32 employees stood beyond the safety line, and the sound they made was not polished or dignified. It was relief, with work boots on. We had one more announcement that day. I had spent the winter working with Marion and our advisors on a new ownership plan. I would retain 51% of Ironwing and continue to control the company as its veteran owner. The remaining 49% would move gradually into a trust for the employees who built, inspected, packed, shipped, and stood behind the work. Calvin had tried to turn ownership into a way to take. I wanted the final answer to be a way to give. Caleb received the first participation certificate. His hands shook when he held it. He said he had expected to be fired after the accident. I told him the company needed more people willing to stop a job, not fewer. Then he surprised me. He reached into his pocket and removed a new red grease pencil. He had wrapped a narrow strip of black tape around the middle so my stiff fingers could grip it more easily. He said, "The old one belongs in the frame." I looked toward the wall. Beside the burned rejection tag was my blistered pencil from the hospital, the one Calvin had called a little crayon. It had marked the pages I accepted, exposed the page I did not, and followed me from a test bay fire to a federal review and back again. I placed the new pencil in my pocket. Then, I watched Caleb's little boy press both hands against the glass outside the bay while his father explained what the machines did. Louise stood beside them. Nia was arguing cheerfully with an electrician about a sensor reading. Marion had taken off her shoes and was eating sheet cake at a folding table. Above us, the Ironwing sign had been cleaned but not replaced. One corner still carried smoke discoloration from the fire. I decided to leave it that way. Not every scar needs to disappear before a place can be whole. For years, Calvin believed my service was a credential, my company was a prize, and my patience was an empty space he could fill with his own authority. He was wrong about all three. The most important thing I protected was not a contract worth $42 million. It was not the lake house, the truck, or even the company by itself. It was the line between being loved and being used. Once I could see that line clearly, I did not need revenge to prove anything. I only needed to stop pretending it had never moved.